Hey everyone, Nathan here, Absurd Being. Okay, let's keep working our way through this final chapter of the visible and the invisible. Before we get into today's video though, just a quick correction of something that I said in the last video. I mentioned there's an asterisk comment on page 135 where I said Merleau-Ponty says the unpresentability is flesh. And that kind of supported the idea of the body not as a thing, but as a sensible for itself, i.e. something that's unpresentable. And that's actually not even that good now that I think about it, because it is presentable. It's just not presented at that moment. It's presentable from a different aspect, or it's not presentable in its entirety, perhaps. But anyway, and thanks to John for pointing this out in the comments, it's not unpresentability, it's original presentability, which is flesh. It doesn't change anything, I think, in the last video that I said about flesh, any of my conclusions or any of my interpretations of what Merleau-Ponty was talking about, but it just means it doesn't quite support the point that I thought it did support. And even now I'm not sure that it does support it anyway. But yeah, not unpresentability it's not the unpresentability that is flesh, but the original presentability, which is flesh. And that word presentability is like visibility, right? It's like it's tapping into that same kind of idea. It's not visible itself, it's not presentable, it's not presenting itself, but it is visibility. It's the capacity to be visible, or presentability, the capacity to be presented. So anyway, that's just a quick comment that I thought I'd start off with. In this video, I've broken it down into 3 sections: flesh, then beyond consciousness, and then finally intercorporeity. So the first part is flesh. Alright, so in the last video we talked about flesh as element. We kind of finished with that idea. It's nothing sensible or mental. It's not physical or psychic. Rather, it's that which forms everything, but that is nothing itself. And Merleau-Ponty talked about this as a style. It conditions the way that things appear, the way that visibles present. And flesh we talked about as being the invisible milieu, or the body as sensible for itself. So not the body as a physical lump of matter, but as this idea sensible for itself. And that was bound up with the idea of distance. That was where distance was created, and these two ideas, although they seem like two different aspects of flesh, are actually the same thing. Flesh as invisible milieu, body as sensible for itself. They kind of are different ways of describing the same thing, rather than two aspects of the same thing, I think. So for this part of this video, I have another quote that I want to give you, just to try and it's always good to get as much information as we can out of this text regarding what flesh is, because it is kind of a tricky concept. So as many points of approach as I can get out of the text is kind of how I've approached this. It's kind of how I've looked to deepen my understanding of what flesh is. So the quote is this: "For if there is flesh, that is, if the hidden face of the cube radiates forth somewhere as well as does the face I have under my eyes, and coexists with it, and if I who see the cube also belong to the visible, I am visible from elsewhere. And if I and the cube are together caught up in one same element, this cohesion, this visibility by principle, prevails over every momentary discordance." Okay, nice. So that is, just like I was saying, adding to this body of knowledge we have about what flesh is. A few things to note. First, both the cube and I belong to flesh. So flesh here, it doesn't surround the thing and I, because we're not separate from it. To think of flesh as surrounding us is to mark us out as individuals, some things within this broader field of flesh. Rather, flesh is it's such a thing that I and the thing can be embedded within. And I think embedded is a good word there, because I and the thing, are not separate from flesh. We emerge out of it. So we're not surrounded by flesh, we're embedded within it. Or as Merleau-Ponty says, they're caught up in flesh. And he also talks about flesh there as that one same element. And that brings us back to that word that he used to describe flesh, element. So that back to that idea, reminding us that this thing, this flesh, isn't any particular thing. It's not a positive thing. This word element is designed to capture that aspect of flesh. Another thing that's interesting, particularly in this quote, is the way Merleau-Ponty talks about the hidden face of the cube as well as the visible face. And this, I think, is a nice reminder of two things. First, that flesh is not the visible or the tangible. It's the invisible milieu, the body as sensible for itself. It's potential, it's latency, it's that capital V visibility. In other words, it's the ground of the visible and the tangible. Another term we might use here is original presentability, that word from the beginning of the video. In other words, the capacity for being presented, for presenting. And the second thing that it reminds us is that it's not just the visible that appears on the invisible flesh. There's also hidden aspects of objects that appear in flesh. And so objects then, in the full sense of that word, are more than just the visible or the tactile, or in general, the sensible. Their hidden aspects, as Merleau-Ponty says, radiate forth somewhere or are visible from elsewhere. So that they're there as part of the object, even though they don't present, even though they're not visible. They still appear, and they appear out of, in, because of flesh. And this idea that objects can have these hidden aspects is connected, I think, to the idea of the inexhaustibility of objects, such that the visible is only the surface of an object. There's an inexhaustibility of depth, Merleau-Ponty talks about. And we'll discuss that in more detail later. Finally, then, with this quote, Merleau-Ponty says that this cohesion, this visibility by principle, prevails over every momentary discordance. So this gives us a unity, one same element, Merleau-Ponty says, while preserving the notion that it's not identical to itself, this unity. It's not one thing. Rather, it's vitiated by difference, and it's subject to the opening of a perspective or perspectives, which, as we're going to see a little bit later on. But it still gives us this unity, this wholeness to it. It's not a separate. Flesh is not composed of parts. It is a whole. It's one thing. but it's not a thing. That's the trick. It's one, but it's not one thing. It's not anything positive that we can reduce to something that we can say of or about which we can say anything positive. But it's not a disparate collection of individual pieces. That's the important thing here, I think. There is this unity to visibility, the visibility that is flesh. But it's not a unity which reduces to any single positive substance, whether that is something physical or non-physical, consciousness or energy or whatever. It doesn't reduce to that kind of thing. So that's just a little bit about flesh. And the second part of the video is beyond consciousness. So first up here, consider Merleau-Ponty. It always comes back to this. It features again and again this idea of my hands touching each other. So consider your left hand touching your right hand. And when you do that, you can tactilely inhabit your left, so that what is being revealed, the landscape, to use Merleau-Ponty's words, being revealed, appears from the locus of your left hand. So the left is touching, the right is touched. But this, Merleau-Ponty says, is reversible at will. So I can, instead of seeing the world, feeling the world from my left hand, I can feel it from my right hand. And now, when I tactilely inhabit my right hand, I change the locus. My right hand is touching, my left is touched. So I'm touching with the top part of my right hand, or your right hand. And this is only possible because each hand, the touching and the touched, belongs to, as we say, although Merleau-Ponty is going to question this way of thinking, one sole space of consciousness. So one consciousness inhabits, if you like, both hands, or both hands refer to this single consciousness. But what about, Merleau-Ponty says, when my two hands touch the same external object? And here it no longer suffices to say that they, the touching hand and the touched object, belong to one sole consciousness. Because then, if that were true, I would know all bodies the way that I know my own body. So, the question then, given that each hand has its own tactile experience, how can they have to do with one sole tangible? That's the way Merleau-Ponty's written it. It sounds good in the book. It sounds weird when I say it. But the idea is, how can my two hands, separate hands with separate tactile awareness, touch the same object, perceive the same object? Or in other words, if this isn't belaboring the point too much, since each hand is capable of touch, how can these individual touches, these little subjectivities, these consciousnesses of, as Merleau-Ponty says, be collated into one single consciousness? And the same goes for my eyes. Each eye is capable of sight independently of the other, and yet they both see the same thing. So how is this possible? How can these little consciousnesses, these little subjectivities, collate into one single consciousness? And Merleau-Ponty answers they can't. We will get out of the difficulty only by renouncing the bifurcation of the consciousness of and the object, by admitting that my synergic body is not an object, that my consciousness is not the synthetic, uncreated, centrifugal unity of a multitude of consciousnesses of, that it is sustained, subtended by the pre-reflective and pre-objective unity of my body. So here Merleau-Ponty is trying to go beyond Cartesian dualism. My body is not an object, and my consciousness is not a synthetic accumulation of discrete sensations, consciousnesses. So rather then, my body as an object is sustained by my body as flesh, the body as for itself. And the same goes for consciousness. Consciousness is also sustained by my body, not this physical lump of matter, but my body as for itself, as flesh, that pre-reflective and pre-objective unity that is my body. And so once we have this idea of flesh, this notion of flesh, we don't need to talk in terms of objects and consciousness. We don't need to divide the world into these two realms, because flesh is prior to both. It's the ontological grounding for both. And we've talked about how both seer and seen are abstractions taken out of this more fundamental reality in an ontological sense, which is flesh. And so another thing that's worth pointing out is when I read that quote, renouncing the bifurcation of the consciousness of and the object, it does seem to lend itself, I think, to an immediate interpretation of, there's no, consciousness is not separate, it's all one big consciousness. It kind of leads to an idealist or even a panpsychist way of thinking. That is definitely not what Merleau-Ponty's getting at here. Some kind of universal mind or something like that. Merleau-Ponty's not going beyond individual consciousness to a general, universal consciousness. Rather, he's saying consciousness is an abstraction. It's a derived picture. It's not necessarily false, if you understand it in the right way, but it's secondary. If you want to understand ontological bedrock, that's where flesh is, and it's a unity. Out of that, you get consciousness, you get self, you get the seer, and you also get the object, the seen. So he's going beyond consciousness to the pre-reflective and the pre-objective body, and that, we've already seen, is flesh. There's also a nice clarification of this body as for itself here. He says individual senses, or he talks about individual senses not being discrete and separate. So rather, my hands and their tactiles are bound to my eyes and their visibles in such a way that they belong to one sole body, not one sole consciousness. Getting away from that dualism. As soon as you start thinking in terms of consciousness, then you wrap yourself up in either dualism or an individual way of thinking, because consciousness is fundamentally individual. And when you start talking about things like universal consciousness, it's unclear what that even means. What can it mean? The word consciousness applies to individuals. And as soon as you start trying to expand it to the universal, I think you run into problems. The definitions just don't match. Either consciousness is what we have as individuals, or it describes basically flesh, in which case the word consciousness is misplaced and just and misleading. So consciousness is, as we use the word and as we understand the word, it's individual. It applies to us as individuals. And Merleau-Ponty is going beyond that. And so that's right, going back to the body and the senses and the way that they interrelate. If you remember, this is what I called the second meaning of the intertwining. Merleau-Ponty goes on to say that this body is a sentient in general, before a sensible in general. And that's another key idea that has come up again and again in the last couple of videos, the general. So we're moving, and I think this reflects a movement from the experience of phenomenology to the ontology of flesh, going from the former, which is personal, individual, to the latter, which is impersonal and general. And it must be that way because that's the only thing that can ground the personal, is the impersonal. You can't have a personal grounding of the personal. The personal can't ground itself. The personal arises out of what is impersonal. The individual arises out of what is general. And that's flesh. And so when Merleau-Ponty recasts the body in those terms, a sentient in general, it's just reinforcing this idea. Ontologically, we are originally this general body for itself, this opening of a perspective in the midst of the world. And a world which is a sensible in general, an opening up onto a sensible, not as a particular thing until we make it a particular thing, but a world that is originally and first a sensible in general. Generality rules here at this level of the ontological, as opposed to, like I was saying, the individual experience that dominates in the field of phenomenology. Which of course isn't to say that phenomenology is wrong, it's just a different way of understanding reality. Both are equally valid within their respective domains. And the third one that I think is important is metaphysics, which we don't deal with here, but I think those three domains together, they are separate and different. They give different answers to the same questions, but they're all valid. Each of those answers is valid and complementary. And I think a full understanding of reality requires all three of those domains. Anyway, that's my book though. So let's move into the third part of the video, which is intercorporeity. So if you cast your mind back to the very first video, way back in this series, you remember we talked about three different aspects to being from Merleau-Ponty. We went back, getting to the things themselves, to the things for others, to the things for me, and to the things for others. So those three aspects. Flesh, we've already seen, has clarified the first two. What the things are themselves and what they are for me, and how those things emerge or arise out of this more originary foundation, which is flesh. Now we're going to move into this last one, the thing for others. But first of all, there's a question here. Why does Merleau-Ponty switch to this word intercorporeity instead of just talking about the other as he used to talk about it in Phenomenology of Perception, and as other people have talked about it in this field, but also that expression, other people. Why switch that out and talk about intercorporeity here? And the reason, I think, is that ontology, where we're dealing with flesh, is a move beyond the framework in which words like subject, consciousness, self, and even object preserve their traditional meanings. And other people is another one of these terms. These all apply to a way of thinking that is individualistic, that focuses on the individual, and then from there starts talking about an external world. And so you get this wrapped up in the language, the framework within which we try to understand reality and ourselves, is this dualistic component. And so those words immediately conjure up for us that framework, and it's hard to break out of it. So I think that's why Merleau-Ponty's using this other word, intercorporeity, here. So anyway, he says, and if I was able to understand how the visible, which is yonder, is simultaneously my landscape, I can understand a fortiori that elsewhere it also closes over upon itself, and that there are other landscapes besides my own. If it lets itself be captivated by one of its fragments, the principle of captation is established, the field open for other narcissus, for an intercorporeity. So if I can understand the process by which a landscape becomes my landscape, that is to say, how it is that a landscape can appear at all in the first place. And that's again back to generality. Understand how landscapes can appear in general. What Merleau-Ponty says, the principle of captation. Or in other words, this is essentially moving from phenomenology, description of that experience, to ontology, an understanding of how that experience arises. In a word, this is flesh, right? Understanding this process. If I can understand that, if I can get to that ontological grounding, that general foundation, then I can understand how there can be other landscapes, other sources of perspectives, other openings of perspectives. In the old consciousness-based language, other people. And so this I think is Merleau-Ponty is trying to effect here a switch in thinking. So traditionally we started from the individual, consciousness, and then moved to understand everything, moved to understand the rest. And what Merleau-Ponty's doing with ontology is starting from the whole, starting from that milieu, which we've come to call flesh. And once you start with that general, then you can work back to understand the individual. But going the other way around gives a false picture, because it approaches, well, like I was saying before, it comes too late. It comes to understand, it tries to understand the whole through the abstractions. So if we want to understand these abstractions, we have to grasp the whole first. Trying to get to the whole from the abstractions will never make sense. You'll never get there until you can effect this change in thinking. And that's essentially what Merleau-Ponty's doing by bringing in this new word, intercorporeity, instead of other people, just wanting to change the terms so we get out of this old way of thinking. And anyway, this is this switch, this move from phenomenology to ontology. That's exactly what we've been doing in the whole book, especially in this last chapter. So the last two videos and this video up until this point. So now we're at a point where we can start to look at the reality of other people, intercorporeity. So at the end of the last section, we talked about replacing the mind-body consciousness object dualism with flesh, that unity, the whole that is flesh, and the sentiment that the body is a sentient in general before a sensible in general as well. Now Merleau-Ponty continues with this quote. Now why would this generality, which constitutes the unity of my body, not open it to other bodies? The handshake too is reversible. I can feel myself touched as well and at the same time as touching. why would not the synergy exist among different organisms, if it is possible within each? Their landscapes interweave, their actions and their passions fit together exactly. This is possible as soon as we no longer make belongingness to one same consciousness the primordial definition of sensibility, and as soon as we rather understand it as the return of the visible upon itself, a carnal adherence of the sentient to the sensed, and of the sensed to the sentient. So this, I think, is another really important quote to get into, to understand the flesh more, but particularly intercorporeity. So the sentient in general, that is my body, in order to be a seer, must also be open to other bodies. It must be sensible, it must be visible. And this, remember, is what I called the first meaning of the intertwining. We've covered this before. But now Merleau-Ponty starts to talk about a handshake. And he says that a handshake is also reversible, although not quite in the same way as my left hand touching my right. It's reversible because I can feel when I shake someone's hand, I can feel my right hand as touching. It's active, it's the locus of my perception. But I can also feel it as touched, and that's the passive side. That I can feel it as the focus of a locus outside me. So whereas I can't feel the handshake, I can't feel my right hand as touched from the locus of the right hand that's touching mine, because that belongs to another body. I can still feel my right hand as touched. I can still switch between those two modes, if you like, touching and touched, active and passive. And this connects to what we talked about in the last video with, was it the last video? 2 videos back maybe. Feeling ourselves looked at by things. The way Merleau-Ponty talked about artists saying that they feel themselves being looked at. And that's capturing this idea that we are, for ourselves, we are seeing, but we're also seen. We are touching, but we're also touched. Capturing that idea of passivity that's essential to any activity. But there, when we talked about that, it was figurative. The chair that I'm sitting on isn't actually touching me, even though I can feel myself being touched by the chair in a sense. I know that the chair isn't actually touching me. But with the handshake, however, now it's different. Now I feel myself as touched, but I feel that my right hand is being touched by another subjectivity. It's being touched by a toucher. There is a touching going on here that was absent when we were just thinking about the inanimate world. So there is then a definite connection between organisms, and that's one of the main points of that quote, I think. And this reveals the truth of other people. It reveals the truth of intercorporeity. And it goes beyond Husserl's attempted justification of other people through analogy, which was essentially doomed from the start because it started with consciousness. It was phenomenological. It started from that individual perspective. And you're never going to reach any kind of level of certitude regarding other people with that approach, because it's locked in on itself. And it's more than just the fact that it's phenomenology. It's the fact that it's phenomenology as conducted from the view of a constituting consciousness. So that was what the problem, I think, with Husserl's attempt to ground or prove the existence of other people. Merleau-Ponty is able to go beyond this precisely because he's gone beyond consciousness to understand its ontological underpinnings. So with flesh, Merleau-Ponty is able to conceive of the whole, including us, as visibility, and sensibility as, instead of an individual conscious experience, the turning back of the visible upon itself. In other words, an operation of the generality that is flesh, rather than the individuality that is consciousness. And all of this, I'll say it again, even though I've said it many times before, I don't think you can understand Merleau-Ponty without understanding this idea that he's reworking phenomenological insights into ontological ones. And this connects with my next point, which is that it's this idea of intercorporeity that Merleau-Ponty has, grounded in the ontology of flesh, is basically Sartre's phenomenology of the look translated to the ontological realm. So Sartre's look was a visceral, undeniable revelation of the other. It doesn't amount to a proof. No proof is possible of other people, because proof requires some kind of analytical operation. It's cognitive. It attempts to know through logic, through some kind of deductive process. That's not how we'll ever understand the reality of other people. But we can still get there, just not through this logical means of proof. We can still get there through, as Sartre did effectively, I think, with the look. We feel ourselves to be looked at, and to be looked at by a human being is different from being seen, as it were, by the computer monitor that's looking at me, or the TV that's looking at me. It's not really looking at me. I don't feel that. I don't get that same sense of being looked at. I don't have that same vulnerability that an other person evokes in me. So there was something, like I say, while not a proof, an undeniable revelation of other people in Sartre's look through phenomenology. Merleau-Ponty's flesh reveals other people in a similar way. It's not as visceral, it's not as concrete as the look, because we're dealing with ontology, not phenomenology, with generalities rather than concrete experiences. So it's never going to have that same kind of, it's never going to evoke the same kind of feelings that phenomenology does. But we still don't have to theorize or speculate or deduce the reality of other people, because once we have our ontological picture clear, they're manifestly evident. It's manifestly evident that other people are real. And they're evident not as other people, which is again that individualistic, conscious-based way of thinking, but they're evident as anonymous visibilities. They're evident as openings of perspectives in flesh. So conceiving of intercorporeity like this actually makes shared experience possible. It is said that the colours, the tactile reliefs given to the other, are for me an absolute mystery, forever inaccessible. This is not completely true. For me to have not an idea, an image, nor a representation, but as it were the immanent experience of them, it suffices that I look at a landscape, that I speak of it with someone. Then, through the concordant operation of his body and my own, what I see passes into him. This individual green of the meadow under my eyes invades his vision without quitting my own. I recognize in my green his green. So Merleau-Ponty says there, it's said that we can't share experience. And this is true if we are thinking of our thoughts, the cogito, if we're thinking in terms of consciousness, idea, image, representation, that traditional way of thinking about ourselves. But immanent, sensible experience can be shared. Why? Because sensibility is experienced through the body as an opening in flesh, where to sense is also to be sensed, to be sensible. And this just goes back to what we've been saying throughout this whole video. If you start from consciousness, individuality, all experience is locked away in the thinking cogito. But if you start from flesh, from the general, then sensible experience is shared. It can't not be, because you belong to the same world. And I quite like that quote there at the end. I recognize in my green his green. And this is nice because it flouts conventional wisdom. But conventional wisdom thinks of green as a quail, right? As the result of conscious activity, locked in the mind, the cogito, locked in a consciousness. We've gone beyond consciousness here. Ontologically, there is a whole anonymous, general mechanism at play here before the sensible becomes an idea like this. Before the visible, what you perceive, becomes an idea, it already belongs to this anonymous, general whole, flesh. And when we get to that level, then we're all experience is shared, just because it can't be otherwise. We all belong to the same. We're immersed in this same reality, embedded in this same reality. So the typical question, right, with this, just to drill down on this a little bit more, this idea, I recognize in my green his green, the question that would be asked is, how do I know that what I see and call green is what you see and call green? How do I know that those are the same things? Maybe when I see green, you're seeing what I would see as blue. How do I know that we're seeing the same things? And there's no way to know that. This way of thinking is approaching the question from the wrong direction. The conclusion to this is not that we're isolated in our own worlds from a reality that we can never know, and from realities that other people might experience. What we share, in other words, is not the exact same experience, but the experience of this world. It's this world that is shared. It's the fact that we're experiencing this world together. That's what's shared here. No, it's not saying that everybody has the same experience. When you see green, you see exactly the same thing. You feel exactly the same way. It elicits the same kinds of connotations for you that it does for me. It's got nothing to do with that. That's an analytical, cognitive, individualistic approach. There is a shared experience here because we're all a part of this same world. And we share it from different perspectives, which means we necessarily have different experiences, but we're still sharing those experiences. The experiences are had in common, even though they may be different. So even in the worst case scenario, if it is true that when I see green, what I see as green, you're actually seeing as what I would see as blue, that doesn't affect Merleau-Ponty, even if that were true. It's probably unlikely that something that extreme could be the case. But even if it were true, that doesn't affect this Merleau-Ponty's claim here, because the shared experience he's talking about goes beyond this individual conscious experience to this ontological general experience we have of this world, this same world. And there is a connection here, I thought, between Merleau-Ponty and the Japanese philosopher Watsuji Tetsuro, who's not hugely famous in the West. I don't know how famous he is in Japan, but I did a video series on him and his book Ethics, and he talks there, he has this concept of in-betweenness, which he talks about as an interpenetration of consciousness of self and other. And part of this is bodily sensations are shared. And a good example of this, I think, is like the sourness of a lemon. The fact that we can talk about that meaningfully, and you can know what I mean when I say a lemon is really sour, and if you then bite into it, you know what I'm talking about. You know what to expect. The fact that we have those common experiences suggests that there is this deeper shared element. But also, he says emotions are shared. We share emotions. It's not, emotions are famously contagious, right? If you come into a room and everybody's really happy and upbeat, that infects you. You feel that same way. It rubs off on you. So there is this. We're not isolated in our little shells. It's not even. I don't even want to say they're shells. We're not isolated in them. Rather we're open. We're all participating in this same shared reality, and that goes back to Merleau-Ponty's, one of the main theses in this book, that to be a seer you have to be seen. To be able to sense something, you have to be yourself sensible. It just comes with the territory. To be active, you have to be passive as well. So there's another quote that I wanted to throw at you here. There is here no problem of the alter ego, because it is not I who sees, not he who sees, because an anonymous visibility inhabits both of us, a vision in general, in virtue of that primordial property that belongs to the flesh. There's no problem of alter ego, because we're not talking about egos. We're not talking about other people, using that old language. We're not talking about other consciousnesses. It's not a problem, because at this level, at this ontological level, other people are anonymous visibilities. They're vision in general. They are a part of flesh. And this is, in an interesting way, similar to Heidegger's Dasein, not in Being and Time, but in his post-Being and Time work, where he talks about Dasein as the sight, and that's an important word, S-I-T-E, the sight of the truth of being. Merleau-Ponty says visibility inhabits both of us. For Heidegger, Dasein is appropriated by being. That same kind of sense there in Dasein, we're appropriated by being, where the sight in which being can, the operation of being can take place. And something similar, in a similar vein, but still obviously quite different, but a similar kind of idea, visibility inhabits us, because before we are the individual selves, consciousnesses that we see ourselves as, we are this general anonymous flesh, visibility. So now that the world is populated with other seers, now that we have intercorporeity on the table, we are for the first time visible to ourselves. It is always from the unique treasury of our own vision that we draw, and experience therefore can teach us nothing that would not be outlined in our own vision. But what is proper to the visible is, we said, to be the surface of an inexhaustible depth. This is what makes it able to be open to visions other than our own. In being realized, they betray the solipsist delusion that consists in thinking that every going beyond is a surpassing accomplished by oneself. For the first time, the seeing that I am is for me really visible. For the first time, I appear to myself completely turned inside out under my own eyes. For the first time also, my movements no longer proceed unto the things to be seen, to be touched, or unto my own body, occupied in seeing and touching them, but they address themselves to the body in general and for itself, whether it be my own or that of another. Because for the first time, through the other body, I see that in its coupling with the flesh of the world, the body contributes more than it receives, adding to the world that I see the treasure necessary for what the other body sees. So that's kind of a long quote. Maybe I didn't need to make it quite that long, but anyway, what is he saying there? We never actually experience a vision from another perspective. So there is a truth to solipsism. We can never experience the world from the perspective of another person. But the visible is the surface of an inexhaustible depth. What does Merleau-Ponty mean by that? I think here the idea goes back to what the visible is, and it is, or it emerges from this invisible milieu, which is pure potentiality, difference. Remember, we talked about the visible being a node in the woof of the simultaneous and the successive, a punctuation in this field. Rather than a positive thing in and of itself, it emerges out of difference in relation to other nodes within this invisible milieu. So being inexhaustible in this way, being open to limitless potentiality, every visible, including ourselves, is open to multiple visions, to multiple perspectives. And when we find ourselves subject to these other visions, these other perspectives, three things I think happen. A, solipsism is seen to be an illusion, or a partial illusion at least. B, I get a glimpse of myself as the seeing that I am. For the first time, I see myself through the eyes of a different perspective, through a different lens. Not literally, of course, but in the way that people react to me, and in the way that people engage with me. That all reveals something about me as the individual seer that I am. And C, my movements, instead of aiming at objects I see or touch, or to my own body as seeing or touching, address themselves to the body in general, i.e. flesh. And I take C to mean that through these other perspectives that are other people, I can come to understand myself ontologically and see my actions in light of this. So again, going beyond phenomenology, beyond Cartesianism, beyond this understanding of ourselves as individual consciousnesses. And that's what I think that last section means. And just one last point to note about this quote is it really brings to mind Levinas, right, and his philosophy, in the way that he made other people central when it comes to pretty much everything, justifying, validating our experience, even grounding objectivity was only possible through other people for Levinas. And Merleau-Ponty's really doing something similar here. For the first time with other people, I appear to myself completely turned inside out under my own eyes. So they give me something that I cannot get on my own. Other people from Merleau-Ponty enable us to see ourselves from the ontological perspective as anonymous visibilities before we are these individual consciousnesses. And that is pretty much where we are. So let's have a look at a summary. First thing, the first part of the video was flesh. And the main idea here, I think, was just this idea that the thing and I are embedded in the unity of flesh. Something that we've talked about before, but just really trying to grasp that idea, get a hold of it. We're not surrounded by flesh, we are embedded in it, and flesh is a unity. It's a whole, even though it's not any particular thing. It's not a collection of different parts. It can't be broken up into parts. It is this unified whole, but a whole that is characterized by potentiality, by difference. And that manifests through the opening of these perspectives, which are ourselves. The second part was beyond consciousness or individuality. So we're going beyond consciousness here to the pre-reflective and the pre-objective. So the generality here of flesh. We talked about that in relation to the body, and in particular the body is, for Merleau-Ponty, a sentient in general before a sensible in general. And again, that idea, the general, anonymous. That's the core of flesh. It's the ontological grounding out of which the individual and consciousness and subject and object and all of those traditional ways of thinking emerge. The final section was intercorporeity. And the first thing we noted here was there's a change in terminology from other people. So this I characterized as a move from phenomenology to ontology, a move from thinking in terms of individuality, consciousness, to generality and flesh. And here, flesh reveals other people as anonymous visibilities. So other people are revealed not via logical deduction or inference. If you get the ontology right, other people naturally appear. And they appear manifestly. They appear without any doubt. There's no doubt here. It's not a proof. We don't get a proof of other people, but their existence is undeniable when we have this ontological lens, when we get our ontology right. And they appear not as consciousnesses or for itself, but as anonymous visibilities. They appear in flesh. And I talked about the way that this is essentially the ontological equivalent of Sartre's look. Then we looked at shared experience and the way that intercorporeity and flesh, or the way that flesh allows for shared experience of intercorporeity. Not necessarily the same experience. It's not that we're having identical experiences, but what's shared is our experience of this same reality, this same world. We're not locked away in our minds. That's a conclusion you draw that seems apparent when you start with the abstractions, when you start with the seer and the seen. When you start with that division, then it seems apparent and it seems inevitable that everybody's locked in their own little minds, in their own Cartesian theatres. But if we get deep enough back, go beyond the abstractions to the ontology, then we see how experience can be and is fundamentally shared. And finally, other people enable us to know ourselves ontologically. That is to say, as anonymous visibilities, as parts of flesh. For the first time, other people open up this dimension for us that was without them, that is closed off, that just doesn't exist at all. And that is the end of the video. So I think there's going to be one more video. I hope there's only going to be one more. I haven't planned the video yet, so I can't say for sure. I hope it's only going to be one, not two, but only time will tell. Thanks for watching. Hopefully it helped, and I will see you in the next one.